Now from King of Bucks Television, it's Tales of the King. Amazing stories from hunters just like you. Every rack in the King of Bucks collection has its own story. But few can match that of Jim Jordan. It's a story of persistence and triumph that stretches across half a century. But it's also a story of loss and disappointment. Ultimately, the story of the Jordan buck is about redemption. But sadly, it's redemption that arrives a few months too late.
It still strikes a chord, I think, in sportsmen to see mega trophies from days gone by. Somebody, before endorsement deals and before records books and before getting your name in the paper or before any recognition whatsoever, the core value of a sportsman was to appreciate what he had, the opportunity that he had, and when an outstanding specimen came along, to honor and celebrate. And that meant keep it. That one is special.
The story of this special deer begins near Hinckley, Minnesota.
Jim Jordan is the prime candidate of our local lore. It's a great story.
John O'Reilly owns a bed and breakfast just a short distance from where this story played out nearly a century ago. A rare replica of the Jordan buck dominates the main room. For O'Reilly, the story of Jordan and his buck has become a passion.
Jim and his friend Ekis Davis, in November 1914, both lived in Danbury, right across the river here, going hunting for deer. They found tracks of a doe, actually a couple of does and a couple of fawns. Saw one of the does, and Jim shot that. And Ekis was interested in that because he had 6 kids at home that he wanted to feed. Ekis dressed the deer and hauled that home. But they'd also seen in these tracks a big set of tracks with one lazy hoof, I guess, so it was very recognizable. And Jim stayed there to follow that. He caught up with it a little further north, approaching Danbury, and got a good shot at it, thought he had a good shot at it, but it ran up across the tracks and toward the river.
Some 50 years after that cold November morning, Jim Jordan pecked out his first-hand account of that day. Its title, I Shot the Largest Buck in the World.
I saw the big buck stand up. He stood long enough for me to get one shot at him. I aimed for his neck, but my gun was too small for him. He started running, so I emptied my gun at him. I knew that I'd hit him, but my bullets hadn't seemed to hurt him. I had one lonely shell left in my pocket, so I put it in the chamber and took off after him.
Jordan was slightly undergunned in his encounter with this monster buck. He was hunting with a .25-20, a rifle far more suited for coyotes than giant white-tailed deer. It's a firearm that carries a special significance for Jerry Martin. He used a gun just like it to take his first deer.
It was this very rifle right here. This is an 1892 Winchester and a .25-20. And it's a very small caliber, and it's really maybe more for varmints and stuff back then, But the old-timers used what they had. I hardly ever pick up this gun without thinking about the Jim Jordan buck. He was probably in the same boat I was. It's probably the only gun he had, and he just made it work, made it count.
I could see that he was hurt. He crossed the river, standing on the bank. I shot him in the back, and he fell.
The deer was so big, he couldn't handle it. So he walked up to Ekis' house, which was only a couple of blocks away. And Ekis, they got a horse and a buckboard and 2 of Ekis' kids to come down to the river to help haul it home. When they got back there, the deer was gone. It had somehow flopped into the river and washed downriver a couple hundred yards, but it was in the middle of the river, washed up on a rock. So Jim and one of Ekas's kids waded out into the river and dragged her in. They were still mostly meat hunters, but there was a fellow that Ekas worked with on the Sioux Line Railroad over there named George, who was a part-time taxidermist. And they talked Jim into having George mount it for him. So a few months later, Jim was wondering how his deer is coming. Got a chance to ride the railroad down there, asked about George, and George is gone. I don't think they knew where he went, but he's gone. And basically, they kind of forgot about it. You know, now you have to fast forward 50 years.
Here's where the story gets real interesting. Missoula, Montana is a long way from Hinckley, Minnesota, but the next chapter in the saga of the Jordan buck can be found here. Missoula is home to the headquarters of the Boone and Crockett Society, and within their archives, the rest of this incredible tale unfolds.
Years and years later, a guy finds this head in a rummage sale and buys it for $3. Recognizes it as, you know, an outstanding specimen. And this guy reads an outdoor periodical that Boone and Crockett has developed this new scoring system, and he read how to do it, and he did it himself. And he came up with a score around 205. And he contacted an official Boone and Crockett measurer. So this official measurer scored it, came up with 206 and 2/8 or something like that. And then that lit the powder keg.
At 206 and 1/8, this rummage sale find beat out the previous record holder, the John Breen buck, by a solid 2 inches. This was the new world record. The hunter was listed as unknown. Bob Ludwig was the lucky guy that had found the deer, and he proudly showed off his prized find to someone he knew would appreciate it, his cousin, Jim Jordan.
Well, recently, we came across the horns of the big buck I killed in 1914. We stopped in at Bob Ludwig's place. He showed Lena and I a rack of horns. We were both shocked when we saw those horns. We recognized them right off. They were the horns from my big buck. We couldn't sleep that night. I called Bob the next morning and asked him where did he get a hold of those horns.
Jordan and his wife Lena ran a small tavern on the outskirts of Hinckley. Never without an epic hunting story, Jordan was a bit of a local celebrity, and he was always ready to share the story of how he had killed the largest deer in the world. Merlin Ladd was a frequent visitor to Jordan's place.
I think I met him in 1969, the year I was a senior. We'd stop at Jim's place, and he didn't care, you know, if you were old enough to stand up, look over the bar, and you had the money, you know, we'd just send in the tallest guy, you know. He'd come out with a couple 6-packs of beer, and away we'd go, you know. Jim didn't care. Well, this Bob Ludwig, I don't know exactly, but he's related to Jim. And he was telling Jim about it, and Jim says, that's got to be the one that I shot, you know. And he described it, I guess, right to a T, how the structure on them horns were, everything about it. So I guess Bob brought it down and showed it to him, and that was it. That was the one he shot.
Jim Jordan spent the rest of his life trying to convince the Boone and Crockett Society that he was the hunter that killed the world record typical whitetail. He presented evidence, tried to locate witnesses, and pleaded his case. His frustration is evident in this handwritten correspondence to the chief of big game records found in the Boone and Crockett archives.
January 23rd, 1971. Dear Mr. B.A. Fashionbauer, I have your letter in hand and glad to hear from you. Bob Ludwig is related to me. He told untrue stories about me and the deer. He knows I killed the deer, but he's afraid I might take the horns, but I won't. All I want to do is have the name of killing the deer.
Jim Jordan was the only living witness. His hunting buddies, his family had all passed on. And it took some doing for him to convince, you know, the powers to be at Boone and Crockett that he was the hunter. And he wasn't looking for money or anything like that. He just wanted recognition that I'm the guy that got that deer. And eventually enough evidence accumulated that the Boone and Crockett Club verified him as the hunter. Sadly, it was 2 months after Jim Jordan passed away by the time they got all the documentation together.
We can only speculate these many years after what Jim Jordan was thinking toward the end. He could have been bitter, disappointed that he never received the recognition he rightfully deserved, or did he secretly smile, knowing in his heart that he had taken the world's largest deer? Perhaps it didn't matter. Either way, he had one heck of a story to tell. At over 206 inches, it's no wonder why the Jim Jordan buck held the world record for so many years. The story alone makes this giant worthy of an honored place among the King of Bucks collection.